So let me come first to the room. If you'd like to make any question, comment. Indira, I think there are online comments. Okay, you have the mic right there.
So this is question from Daniel Obrako in Accra. Since the country started producing cocoa, the economy has gained immensely from cocoa. The unfortunate and interesting thing is that the sector is held by farmers who are poor mostly. The other unfortunate situation is the disbursement of the cocoa scholarship. Children of non-farming parents get more scholarships than children of farming parents. How are cocoa farmers insured for their health, especially at their old age? Why are children of cocoa farmers not interested in cocoa farming?
Indira, thank you very much. If there are one or two questions in the room, I'll take them at this time. Sir, there's a microphone coming your way. And then I come back to the panel.
First, let me thank the panel. It was an excellent discussion that you started off with. But this very same discussion took place back in the 1990s when USAID and others were setting up something called the Sustainable Tree Crops Project. Questions of small farmers getting almost little or nothing for price for their product. Secondly, even basic human needs, sometimes the prices that they receive are basically insufficient. Thirdly, lack of modernization within the subsector of cocoa. Yes, excellent research institute. However, do the technologies actually trickle down or get down to the farmers? And are the farmers capable of absorbing many of the technologies given the income that they have and the resources required to support the technologies? So obviously, I heard today there needs to be a systemic approach. That systemic approach I'd like to hear should include what? And I do think crop diversity is one of them, is definitely one of them. But not just crop diversity. Agriculture is no longer a stovepipe sector. So what are the other sectors that need to intersect with the cocoa subsector in order to, one, modernize it, two, educate and attract young people to that sector, and then thirdly, to get more of an investment, and the word is investment, of the farmers into the entire subsector, not just growing cocoa on a farm. Everybody knows the producers are always the least paid along the supply chain. So how do we get the farmers more involved in other aspects of the value chain?
Panelists, will you permit me to take two more? I see hands up here, and then we come back and do a group response. There was a gentleman right here in the front, Pamela, right here in the front, yeah.
Thank you, and Ambassador, good to meet you again. I'm from Ghana. Fortunately, myself and my colleagues happened to be in Washington, so we decided to come. And I actually grew up on a cocoa farm. My father was a cocoa farmer. He died some 11 years ago. But in line with what the ambassador was saying, since he died, I have never gone back to the cocoa farm. And there's a reason. Part of the reason, in my view, is the cocoa board. And here I think we need to look closely at the shares that go to farmers. In fact, you are right, officially, the announcement is that it's about 70–75%. And not quite long ago, I did some calculations. I work for the trade union, so we also have farmer groups. I did some calculations for 2016. And then my own calculations show that actually farmers receive 54%. So in order to confirm it, I called the cocoa board, and the person I spoke with said, oh, okay, what you have is the gross FOB. What they have is the net. So between the gross and the net, the cocoa board kept about 21% of that for what it calls industry interventions, including cocoa board scholarship, the mass spraying, and all those things. But as the caller from the questioner from Ghana said, in fact, the whole of 2016, Cocoa Board never granted a single scholarship. So why did you keep the money in the first place? What happened to it? So this is a concern, and I read the part of the book that calls for greater transparency in the cocoa industry. I think it's important. Farmers today are selling their cocoa farms to mining companies, small-scale miners, and it's having effect on cocoa production. But I also agree with you when you say that you don't necessarily have to increase production. We have to bargain for a higher price for ourselves as a country. And in this case, Ambassador, he's right. 60% or more of cocoa comes from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. We are next door. Why can't we cooperate? What is happening to the silos put up in the 1960s to store cocoa, so that the oversupply which occurred last year and which has dipped the price could be kept on the domestic, on the international market? I think there's greater need for Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire to collaborate. There are only 9 countries in the world or so, 9 businesses in the world that buys cocoa. They meet every year and determine how much they will pay. Why can't the 2 countries, neighbors, that produce more than 60%, meet every year and also determine how much they will put on the world market?
Thank you very much. Let me come to the panel. I know that several more hands. I'll do a second round. I would like to ask the panelists, be brief so that we have a chance to hear more questions and comments. And I will begin with you, Shashi, and then I will walk down. Shashi? And now feel free to also reflect on the ambassador's comments, please.
Yeah, my excuse for not dealing with what the ambassador and rest of the panelists suggested is that this isn't a book about cocoa. I mean, this isn't a book about chocolate. It's a book about cocoa, a more or less complete look at cocoa and not about the chocolates. And I come to the same conclusion that you do as to how do you increase the income of farmers. One obvious suggestion that most of us come up with is you increase productivity. Well, where is the guarantee that with increased productivity you're going to get higher prices? And then you look at in the literature, is that really, how does one really negotiate a larger share? This is a kind of a commodity, unlike coffee, in which, as Simran noted, that the cocoa share in the ultimate product is very small. So it's a different type of commodity compared to coffee or tea, for example, where you could add much greater value and enter into the market. So those are difficult issues. They need to be addressed, and I would actually look at that. These are important issues as to what do we do with this situation. Yes, there is. I mean, I still firmly believe that. I mean, you have to commend Cocoa Board for what it has done, but it ought to be doing more. It ought to be more transparent. It ought to be really more accountable, and that is the kind of conclusions that we are coming up with. And the recent developments are showing up to be so. The Cocoa Board is going to be hauled up and then straightened out. You know, all this, the thrust of our research is, if you depend on a public organization in order to perform what you think could be efficiently done by the market, what kinds of institutional mechanisms must be there to hold that public organization accountable? That was the thrust of this really research. We're saying there is political accountability and there is farmers, but there is a limit to it. How much are you going to push these public organizations, make them efficient, is really the challenge. The other issue, Cocoa Board, you mentioned, I mean, the children of cocoa growers, it's largely because it isn't very profitable. It's pure drudgery. Cocoa is produced today as it was produced 100 years ago, just with cutlass and baskets, and parts are broken, they're carried over the head and then dried. Similar way, technology has changed, so there is nothing technologically superior that attracts youth to go into cocoa, nor there is profit. You could say they would ignore all of this, and if it were indeed very profitable. That sure is a challenge not only for cocoa, but for general agriculture in Ghana. I will just leave the rest to the others.
Yes, the ambassador, sir. There's a mic there. can just press on the button. Yeah.
Well, I can't claim that I'll remember all the questions that were put up, but if I can take the gentleman first, I'm glad that you are in some kind of trade union, platform. And I think maybe one of the responsibilities you would want to take is to try to energize people, farmers in particular, for them to start looking at what is due to them. The scholarships thing that you mentioned, when I was in secondary school, most of the kids who held cocoa marketing board scholarships were children of what you call clerks and whatnot, who worked for the cocoa board. Most of the farmers' kids never got any because their parents were not even in a position to put in the application. And besides, I can give you that in my time, I used to live in an area where cocoa board was developing housing for their senior staff. My mom came to visit me once. We went for a walk. And I said, oh, this is where senior people in cocoa board are coming to live. So, oh, is that so? A week later, she asked me, if that is where the cocoa board officers are going to live, where did they leave the farmers? Now, that was a very incisive question. So I promised her if she wanted, I'll take her to cocoa board head office for her to ask that question to the chief executive. So there has always been that disparity in the industry, and maybe it's one of the areas one has to look at. And I also think that in trying to attract younger people to go in, there ought to be some kind of system that runs through the education sector, to the extent where the government can decide that this year, so many scholarships are going to go to people who had the intent of going into agriculture, and especially into the cocoa industry. And also, part of the problem we have is that we produce the cocoa. We don't drink cocoa products. We don't eat cocoa products. I think the average Ghanaian child in an average year doesn't eat 2 bars of chocolate. So where we are not consuming and other people are, obviously there will have to be a certain kind of tilt insofar as our proceeds from the product are concerned. Remember, in one of our languages, they say that if the princes don't fight, the slaves run away. And this applies to the cocoa industry. And also, you may want to take a look around you. There are times when you go to a conference talking about cocoa and they drink coffee. So when you have that kind of disparity in mindset, it goes to undermine the prospects of the product that you are talking about. And I suspect that we have to sit down, examine the whole industry, and take specific measures to rectify some of these things. I have no difficulty whatsoever if there would be a skew of support in the education system for anybody who wants to go into agriculture, and especially cocoa, as opposed to somebody who wants to go to read ancient Greek and whatever. Sure.
Thank you. Simran?
Oh, yours is on. I'll take it. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to take this opportunity to clarify when the manufacturers who were there at the World Cocoa Conference said crop diversification, absolutely, that is correct. However, again, the question is how much of that money will go back to the farmers if they are diversifying? And I think fundamentally that's the question that has to continue to be asked. The reason people are leaving is because this crop is not taking care of them. Of course, then you go to mining, which is so terribly destructive. But you think of a place like Ghana, and Ghana has lost. There was a report that was released quite recently from an NGO called Mighty Earth, and it shows that Ghana has lost about 60% of its forests since 2000 and around 70% since independence. So without action, the report states, Ghana stands to lose all remaining forests outside its national parks in the next decade. This is like, I don't know, there must be some saying in Ghana, I'm sure there was also in India, the snake eating itself, right? We poison our soil through mining, then we can grow nothing. We deforest our nations, and for what? For chocolate some other little kid eats in another country. How do we return this power to ourselves? And, you know, as stated so eloquently in the introduction of the book, a country cannot depend on transnational firms to build the reputations of the commodities it exports. I will add to this, nor can it expect that said transnationals will adequately care for the people who work so hard to cultivate these commodities. If we don't take care of ourselves, then no one else is going to do this. Now, yes, Bill mentioned Cocoa Action, reaching a small percentage of 300,000 out of Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana combined. 800,000 farmers in Ghana. I don't know how many in Cote d'Ivoire. A little bit more. So some work to do there. That's a great effort. But the goal of a corporation is to make money for its shareholders. And on the last call that Mondelez had with its shareholders, it talked about what this price drop had done. So it has devastated the cocoa industry, but the $100 billion confection industry benefits from this, right? So these distortions have to be addressed. And again, I just come back to, I'll say one last thing about this in regards to sustainability, because we talk a lot about this idea of sustainable cocoa. And there's a definition that I'm not going to be able to find this minute. But in any case, what the definition says, which I'll bring up in later comments, is that we can't solve these problems in the same ways that these issues have been created. And so this is really, I think, again, I'll say, an opportunity to really think outside of the box, think about local consumption, think about agency in a completely different way, and how we can put farmers at the center of this. Not only the responsibility of CocoaBod, but the responsibility of the world that consumes chocolate to really understand and support the people who are behind these products.
Great, very well said. I'd just like to add that, particularly on your last comment, it's how do we empower and put farmers at the center of all of this. Any type of action that happens to see how that's going to impact on the farmers. And although a lot of people have tried it, sometimes it's been successful and a lot of times not. I think that needs to be the ultimate goal always for the public and the private sectors. Just getting back to a few of the comments from the audience, Jerry, you mentioned about the diversification piece, and I think the other thing to do is how we can encourage these farmers, these millions of small-scale farmers, to look at cocoa more as a business than as a, just as a commodity that they harvest once a year. So bringing them more into the business of cocoa farming and helping them to also organize into groups. In Cote d'Ivoire, there are some very strong farmer groups and co-ops that are forming. In Ghana, you have Kwapo Cocoa, but beyond that, there's not a lot of farmer groups out there. So I think the more you bring groups together, farmers together, train them, empower them, I think that is an equalizer in the marketplace.
Bill, thank you so much. I know we have some passionate hands here, and I know we are close to time, but let's take them, let's hear from them. Let's begin with the lady right here. If you can keep your comments, questions short, all of you, that will be much appreciated so we can have a chance to hear from all of you.
This is to His Excellency.
Please tell us your name. Huh?
My name is Kathy Owen. I live in New York City, and I came here to be with you for this reason, this celebration. Your Excellency, is it possible to create opportunities through artificial shortages? And I participated in the AU's initiative of building bridges across the Atlantic. Can you reach out to your diaspora? And lastly, can you involve academicians in some process as PhDs in the process of marketing? Oh, I do have one more question. Can you also make certain that you create new ideas for an old product? What medicinal purposes might cocoa have? We've got to find other ways and things that you can do, because anybody who exports raw materials never make money. So somehow you've got to get some complete product to us.
Thank you very much. The gentleman over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Yaya Fanussi. I'm with United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force, and this is Kwame Nkrumah. I was with him in Conakry in 1967. We're about to solve the problems you're talking about. there will be a federation, and that will handle the issue that you're raising, because we'll then be manufacturing not just cocoa into finished products in all over the country, and then the international community will have to face what we have, because there's competition, domestic consumption of the products, and then they will have to pay higher for the raw materials. It's going to happen. We'll talk after I finish.
I love it. It's going to happen. Indira, you have online questions, and then I'll come to the back. Yeah.
I have two questions. One from Brian Bruns, independent consultant. To the extent the cocoa board has been successful, is it due mainly to internal factors in the sector, or how much did it depend on larger changes which have led to better governance overall in Ghana? The second question is from Mary, independent consultant. Ghana is working on a READ, which is United Nations Program on Reducing Emissions for Deforestation and Forest Degradation strategy with the cocoa sector. How much contribution do you think it could bring to cocoa farmers?
A lot of substantive questions here. Gentleman at the back.
Hi, my name is Brian Conklin. I'm with USAID. I just returned from 4 years in Ghana and worked very closely with Shashi. Good to see you, and thank you for the presentation today. A question is, there was a discussion over the last few years about forming a commodity exchange in Ghana, for example. The irony is the one commodity that wasn't being considered for the commodity exchange was cocoa. And it seemed like that would have been an opportunity to kind of seize the market between Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, forming kind of a regional exchange. The reason why I bring this up, when you look at how they did coffee in Ethiopia, where coffee prices were being suppressed and coffee farmers were ripping out their coffee plants to grow cotton and other things, moving to a more transparent system where farmers knew within a few seconds of what the international price was for a product and could do the math on their own as far as setting their price, really brought much more of an equity into the market for farmers. And I know there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of history, there's a lot there, but when we're looking at more transparent mechanisms to bring fairer pricing to farmers, to me that seems to be an important and critical component. So I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Okay, wow, that was a speed dialing of a number of questions and comments. I'm going to begin with you, Bill, and walk this way. And I'm going to ask you to be selective, sadly, in responding to comments, and then there's a chance to continue the conversation after the formal end. But we'll walk this way, Bill.
Great. Maybe I can start with the last question. I was working on a project with the African Development Bank last year, looking at ways that Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana might be able to collaborate together on some of the issues. And one of the topics that was raised was this commodity exchange. So our team looked at that, it looked at the feasibility of potentially doing that, and still in its early phases, we looked at an outline for that. I think in Cote d'Ivoire there are possibilities of how that could happen, and we looked at the Ethiopia model as well. In Ghana, more complicated because of the marketing parastatal in place. So there would have to be some major changes. It's possible, but right now with the current structures in Ghana particularly, I don't think that would work yet. But it's a nice thing to explore, and perhaps there might even be a delegation from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire that could visit Ethiopia to look at how that coffee exchange works there.
Thank you. Simran?
I spent some time with ECX. In my book, I also cover coffee, and it is quite remarkable to go to a very remote village and see the price, the billboard listed very clearly as to what the price of coffee is. Just a few points that there is some great hope to try to bring farmers together in an organization that would maybe be similar to WCF, and that is the Farmgate Foundation. Saka Warren has been working very hard to try to bring that together, but culturally there's so much that has to come together, but I think that collaboration is critical because through connection and through those numbers, we do have the opportunity to achieve more power. And I also will just add, this is something that Mr. Joseph Aidu said. He's the chief executive of COCOBOD. When he was at the World Cocoa Foundation partnership meeting back in the fall, he said prices are the best fertilizer for improving livelihoods because they send signals to farmers as to the amount of time and labor to invest in cocoa production. Thus, low prices constitute a major threat to the sustainability of the industry. So I just think as we move forward and think about this, Bill had mentioned earlier in his talk references to climate change. There are these imminent threats, and then there's with a far more immediate one, and balancing these things out and always injecting the concern around poverty into this conversation, because the shift to something like rubber or to mining can happen, you know, on a dime, and especially if the only relationship you have with this crop, with this cocoa, is one of misery, you know, or one of challenge. So again, by creating these products close to home and consuming it, that not only shifts production, but it also transforms the relationship that we actually have with the food.
I guess I'll take your comment about new products, you know, from the cocoa industry. We probably don't even have to create so many new products because, again, when I was a boy in the small villages, cocoa was a basis for a whole lot of different types of food. There were additions to, you know, the others. There were more or less spices for, you know, other kinds of foods and such. The only thing that has happened is that because most of us became what we accept as educated, we started consuming items which have never been good for us. So our body sizes have changed, our heights have changed and all that. So we can bring those back onto the market and then actually export some of them to those countries that are now having problems, you know, with regard to, you know, weight and whatnot. So we don't actually have to invent too many things. And I think the problem has to do with the fact that with the previous farmers, as it were, dying off, the knowledge and the technique are basically getting buried. So we have to accelerate a way of getting the younger folk, that is, if we can entice them back into, you know, farming, and especially cocoa farming, obviously, you know, might make a difference. And I don't particularly subscribe to having to change products, because, you know, the fact that you manage to make, you know, $10 in an hour doesn't mean that you have conquered poverty. The important thing is to, you know, make sure that whatever you are doing would yield more than the $10 that, you know, you are reckoning with. And that one calls for innovation. It calls for persistence. It calls for the kind of attitude which says that whatever it is that I'm doing, I have to do it better. Because you have to believe that even the best of bottles can still be polished and make to look like it is a different product. So there is the need for innovation. But the more important thing is to get younger people to go back into cocoa production. That one will call for more and, in a way, intense, you know, campaign amongst the youngsters, because then you also have to recognize that they will be looking at parity with regard to those who don't go into the industry and those who go into the industry. As for collaboration with Côte d'Ivoire, at the moment we are doing a lot of collaboration. There have been a lot of cross-border consultations and whatnot, because we do realize that we are obviously in the same boat, except that our side of the boat charges more than the other side of the boat because of the fact that our cocoa qualities are a little different. But the commonality of interest we recognize, so we are working on it. Sure.
Thank you, sir. And Shashi, the
Just
final wrap-up.
just a couple of questions. One, to answer that question on the performance of the cocoa board, whether it was due to internal and governance. Yes, obviously it depends on the kinds of prices and revenues and costs that it faces, which depends on the international market, as well as the kind of governance that you see at the country level. While we commend cocoa board, I don't think we should forget that they haven't performed consistently. Various governments have had to take drastic measures to put them in order. It's not a parastatal or any other parastatal for that matter. You could put it in charge and let it perform by itself, hence the emphasis that constantly it needs to be held accountable. The other one is something Simran mentioned, about definition of sustainable cocoa, and I was thinking of it. I came up with four criteria. I said the production system is sustainable. Number one, if it demonstrates consistent supply or maybe a growth in supply. Number two, living incomes for the farmers and incentives to continue to produce cocoa. Otherwise, they would switch over to other crops, so forth. Third, an important element, it has a labor practices that doesn't involve child labor, where continues to be a problem. And fourth is something that doesn't destroy diversity and maintains environment. And I think these are the four I thought would make it a sustainable supply.
Colleagues, thank you so much. I know that you will join me in just appreciating the richness of the presentations and discussions by our panelists, but we also want to thank you for the richness of your questions and comments and suggestions. We will have the event video up in 2 days. I hope that you will continue to interact with our panelists over here and that you will continue to press Shashi for Cocoa Coast version number 2. But please join me in thanking our panelists.